integrated education. So during this unit, we are going to focus on promoting equality and value diversity. So we are going to talk about how we can promote equality and value diversity, and how we can take into account special educational needs, if any. So integrated education focuses very much about promoting equality and diversity, and at the same time understanding some of those special needs so that we can ensure that all learners are included in the learning environment. So let's have a look at what we're going to be focusing at the very first session. So at the very first session, which is going to be on the topic of equality and value diversity, we're going to again summarize our understanding of the Equality Act 2010 and how that needs to be taken into consideration when developing and delivering learning and teaching programs. We're also going to be talking about some of the ways for us to promote equality of opportunity within the classroom environment and within the classroom dynamics. Okay, so depending on where you're joining us from, which country, as kind of not homework but perhaps preparation for this particular session, you could also be thinking of some of the key legislation that has been implemented by your own governments around equality, as I'm giving you an example here from the United Kingdom, and you could bring that to the session so that we could discuss how we could be creating opportunities of equality and making sure that the environment is inclusive. So this is kind of a big piece here that we're going to focus on during the first session. Okay, and then the second session, we are going to look at special needs education, and to kind of give you a bit of an overview of what special needs education is, because it is important that we understand that sometimes we could have learners with special needs, and usually governments, they do have again legislation on how to treat and how to create learning curriculum to actually support special learning or special educational needs. Okay, so there are certain elements of legislation that we need to comply with as practitioners within those fields. So what is special needs education? That is education designed to facilitate learning by individuals who require additional support and adaptive pedagogical methods in order to participate and meet the learning objectives. So what are some of those special needs? By the way, if you think of special educational needs, there is an acronym here which is called SEND, and that acronym actually, when you see that in the web or on some educational websites or some government websites in English-speaking countries, SEND usually refers to special educational needs. So what are some of those special educational needs? Let's take a moment and briefly go through them. At the actual session, we're going to go into them in much more detail, but let's take a moment to understand what they are. We've got cognition and learning needs here. We also have communication and interaction needs. So someone who may have cognition and learning needs, that could be someone who has been diagnosed, for instance, with autism. Communication and interaction needs, that could be if someone has a speech impairment, for instance, and that is an impairment that we should be catering to when we are preparing the curriculum. Also, social, emotional, and mental health needs. It could be that some of our learners have emotional needs that we should be taken into consideration, or perhaps they could be experiencing social anxiety. I could give you an example from my experience as a facilitator of various learning and development programs. A couple of years ago, I was in the city of London and I was delivering a training session on stress management, and I had prepared different training materials but also different activities, and I would usually split people into groups to take part in some of those learning activities because I had discovered what their learning styles were. Some of them would learn by doing, so that is why group activity was one of the activities I had picked to support me in meeting the learning outcomes. So there was a gentleman who felt quite resistant to taking part in group learning, and also he was resistant to answering questions when I would engage him as I was engaging the rest of the learners. And later on, I discovered that he was suffering from social anxiety, but he had not communicated that to their manager, so that we did not know. So when we're talking about how we can best support learners with special needs, it is always useful to think about questionnaires or ways for us to identify whether our learners have any of those needs, because sometimes people may not necessarily feel comfortable disclosing such information. So there are certain ways you could facilitate such information, so that when you are designing and preparing curriculum, these aspects are taken into account. And during session 2, we actually are going to be talking about that as well. And then also our learners may have sensory and physical needs. For instance, if we've got learners who are in a wheelchair, this is information that we should be collecting in advance, especially if you're, for instance, if you're delivering learning activities, learning programs, training programs face to face, and we know that some of our learners, or one of our learners for instance, is in a wheelchair. We should be thinking of how to ensure that they get to our learning environment safely. There also will be an element of special instructions that will need to be communicated to the actual attendee with sensory, or let's say with, in that instance, physical needs. So these are some of the things that we should really be taking into consideration. Whether you are delivering training to adults, whether you are delivering training to students, we should always make sure that we have as much information as possible in advance when it comes to the various special needs, if any there may be none. And also, especially when we're working with students from within certain age groups, let's say under 20 years old, then especially let's say teenagers or kids, for instance, it is really important that we follow the government legislation as to how we facilitate training and teaching to people with such needs. So that the legislative element here is really important, and we're going to be discussing that at the session. Okay. As I just said, as I just mentioned, there is actually a code of practice that has been adopted in the UK, and that is to give you an example of some of the legislation. That is why I decided to include that here. So learners between 0 and 25 years old, when we have learners within that age group, it is important that we are aware of the SEND code of practice. So when you attend the session, I'm going to be asking you, or the facilitator of the session is going to be asking you to really think about examples from your own countries and how we could make sure that we are aware of the various legislation and taking it into consideration as well. Okay. And then we're also going to look at using assessment in order to determine whether our learning goals have been met. You might have already noticed that every unit covers the topic of assessment, and that is important because we are going to be summarizing and looking at the different ways of assessment to ensure that we are always coming back to evaluating and assessing the learning outcomes and whether they have been met. And remember, we spoke about assessment and how assessment really involve assessing the actual learner, and when it comes to evaluation, that is evaluating the overall training activity. But here, for the purpose of this slide, this session, we're going to talk about the different methods of assessment in order to enhance learning. And we're also going to be talking about assessing learners with special needs as well. Okay? And now we are going to move to technology in education.